Have you ever thought about why a jackal became one of the most important symbols of the afterlife in ancient Egypt? It might seem strange to us today that a creature that is often thought of as a scavenger and prowler around the edges of settlements would become the god of embalming and the guardian of tombs. But to the Egyptians, this choice made perfect sense. Anubis, who is often shown with the smooth black head of a jackal, or as the animal itself, was the eternal guardian of the dead, helping souls make the difficult journey from life to death. His image is one of the most famous in all of Egyptian art, but his story goes much deeper than just statues and wall paintings. It is linked to the core beliefs of Egyptians about life, death, and the chance of renewal after death. The Nile Valley had fertile floodplains and a well-organized society, but it was also a place where life and death were always close to each other. The green ribbon of life was surrounded on all sides by a harsh and unforgiving desert. The sounds of animals could be heard at night beyond the fields that were being worked on. The jackal's cry was often the most disturbing. These animals lived well on the edges of human activity, sneaking between villages and burial grounds and eating from shallow graves or empty tombs. People who lived near cemeteries were both scared and unable to avoid seeing jackals. Over time, what was once thought to be a threat became a spiritual protector. Instead of seeing the jackal as a threat to the dead, the Egyptians saw it as their eternal protector. Anubis was born in this way, and his form was a divine reflection of the animal that haunted the border between the safe world of the living and the mysterious silence of the tomb. The Egyptians' obsession with the afterlife is closely tied to Anubis's job as a guardian. The Egyptians cared a lot about keeping the body safe and the careful ritual of burial, which was different from many other ancient cultures. They thought that the body was like an anchor for the soul, a place where it could continue to live. The soul could be lost if the body was damaged or destroyed. Anubis became the protector in this delicate balance. The dead would not be left alone under his watchful eyes, as shown by his presence in tombs, carved images at entrances, and papyri. People who lived with the constant reminder that death was always close by found him to be a very comforting god. When we look at the oldest pictures of Anubis, we can see that his shape and color are both very interesting. Anubis is usually painted black, but natural jackals are sandy brown. This was a conscious choice. The annual flood of the Nile left behind black soil that was very fertile and helped Egypt's agriculture grow. Black was also the color of bodies that had been preserved naturally in desert sand. Black meant both death and life to the Egyptians. It meant both endings and new beginnings. By painting Anubis black, artists showed that he was both the god who saw death and the god who protected the chance for rebirth. Every stroke of black paint made the point that death was not the end, and that there was a way to move on with Anubis's help. Anubis shows up in many tombs in ways that show how he protects people. He is shown crouched on the lids of coffins, with his long snout and upright ears ready for anything that might happen. In the wall paintings, he stands next to the dead person and puts a steadying hand on their shoulder, as if to guide them forward. Priests wearing jackal masks embodied him during funerary rituals, bringing the god's presence into ceremonies that got the body ready for its eternal journey. For the families watching, this was more than just a show. People thought that Anubis himself would come down at this holy time and take control of the body and soul. The god wasn't far away. He was right there, standing among the mourners and making sure that everything went as planned. But what did it really mean for a people to put their faith in a god like Anubis to take on such a big job? We need to think about how the Egyptians were always aware of order and chaos in order to understand this. The idea of ma'at, which means balance of truth, justice, and cosmic harmony, shaped their world. Death, with its unknowns and interruptions, could upset this balance. Tomb robbers, neglect, or wrong rituals could upset the order and make the dead more vulnerable. Anubis, with his sharp eyes and strong presence, was the force that kept chaos from taking over the space between life and death. Egyptians found comfort in him because they knew that even after death, order would still be in place and their loved ones would be safe. Anubis's presence in Egyptian thought is even more interesting because there is another layer to it. Anubis was never a kingly figure, unlike Osiris, who became the most important god in the afterlife. He was not given a crown or put on a throne. He was a guardian, a ritual worker, and a friend to the dead instead. In a way, this brought him closer to regular Egyptians. They might not have seen themselves in Osiris, whose story was full of power, murder, and resurrection. But they could trust Anubis, the watchful figure who bent over the body to make sure it was taken care of. His job was both spiritual and practical, and the Egyptians relied on that practicality. They knew that the jackal-headed god, who never looked away from his work, was the only one they could trust to make sure they got there safely. The story of Anubis's beginnings is also a story about how the Egyptians made sense of what they saw around them. Jackals near cemeteries may have scared people, but instead of trying to get rid of them, Egyptians accepted them into their way of thinking. They gave the jackal meaning by making it a god, which might have been seen as a destructive force. This change shows how creative Egyptian religion was. It could turn looking at the natural world into a deeply meaningful spiritual system. Anubis was both the jackal they knew and something much bigger, a divine being that turned the ordinary into the holy. Anubis's name only got better over time. He was not only responsible for protecting common graves, but also royal tombs. The most well-known example is the Anubis Shrine found in Tutankhamun's tomb. A beautiful statue of a lying jackal rested on a gilded shrine there, facing west, which is the way to the land of the dead. The message was clear. Anubis had to protect even the most powerful pharaoh. No amount of money or power could take the place of the god as the eternal protector. The shrine is one of the most striking reminders of how important Anubis was to Egyptians' ideas about death and what came after it. This is true for both archaeologists and people today. But even with all of this grandeur, Anubis's image never lost its close quality. He is shown in papyrus scrolls like the Book of the Dead, helping regular people through the judgment process. His hand guides them to the scales, and his presence keeps them steady as their fate is decided. He was different from other Egyptian gods because he was both very important to the universe and very caring. He was both a guardian for everyone and a guide for each person. He took care of the pharaoh as well as the farmer. He was loved by people from all walks of life because he didn't care about rank. He cared about duty. So, when we think of Anubis as the dog guardian, we are talking about more than just a symbol or a design. We are seeing how Egyptians dealt with their biggest fears and hopes. The sound of jackals in the desert became a promise instead of a threat for him. The black color of death became a chance for new life in him. And in him, the unknowns of the afterlife became something he could handle with help and protection. Anubis was the god who never left the dead behind, who always watched over them, and who made sure that no soul would be alone on its journey. What does the name Anubis mean? And how did the Egyptians talk about him before the Greeks added him to their own pantheon? When we start to look into where his identity came from, we see that the story of Anubis is not just about a jackal-headed god watching over the dead. It's also about language, culture, and how names meant a lot in the past. Names were never just labels for the Egyptians. They were strong vessels of meaning that held a being's essence and changed how people remembered them. It was believed that saying the name of a god would bring that god's presence to you. The names that people gave to Anubis tell us a lot about how he was seen throughout Egypt's long history. In the earliest inscriptions, which are from the Old Kingdom, the god we now call Anubis was called Inpu or Npw. The sound I is represented by the reed leaf symbol, and the sound N is represented by the water ripple symbol, followed by a hieroglyph of a seated deity, which shows that he is divine. Scholars have argued about what Inpu really means, but a few different ideas give us some hints about who he is. Some people think it meant the royal child, which would connect him to divine parentage and maybe even earlier cosmic myths. Some people think it has to do with decay or putrefaction, because he was directly involved with death and embalming. These two possibilities, nobility and decay, are like how Egyptians often combine two ideas that seem to be opposite into one divine figure. Anubis could represent both the honor of sacred kingship and the physical decline of the body. The Greek name Anubis came about much later, when the Greeks were in contact with Egypt after Alexander the Great's conquest. The Greeks were interested in Egypt's gods and wanted to incorporate them into their own beliefs. They changed Inpu into the smoother-sounding Anubis, which eventually became Anubis in Latin and modern English. The name changed shape, but the core of it stayed the same. The Greeks' use of the name shows how flexible ancient religion could be, with gods moving between languages and cultures while keeping their main traits. But for Egyptians, the old names and nicknames meant a lot more than the simple ones we use today. Those names are very telling. People called Anubis first of the Westerners, which may sound strange at first, but it makes sense when we remember that the West was linked to the land of the dead. The Egyptians thought that the souls of the dead went west to start their afterlife, because the sun set in the west and disappeared into darkness every night. They called Anubis this name to show that he was the best protector of people who had crossed that line, the one who went before everyone else in the land beyond the horizon. He was also called the Lord of the Sacred Land, which was a name for the necropolises that were scattered along the edge of the desert. These holy places, which were full of tombs and mortuary temples, needed to be protected from desecration. Anubis's title made him the god who watched over their safety. Master of Secrets is another name that shows a different side of his power. People who were alive could not fully understand death, embalming, and the journey to the afterlife. The priests who got bodies ready for burial followed strict rules that were kept secret from the public. The Egyptians called Anubis the Master of Secrets because they knew he knew things that no one else could understand, like secrets about death and resurrection that only a god could know. People in a society where knowledge was sacred and the afterlife was both scary and hopeful would have strongly identified with this name. It is interesting to see how the Egyptians carefully connected names to their jobs. Anubis's identity was not fixed. Anubis was once known as the god of the dead. He was the main god in charge of burials and guiding the souls of both kings and commoners. As Osiris's story became more important and Anubis's job changed to protecting and embalming, his titles changed too. Instead of fading into obscurity, Anubis became the god who oversaw the practical and ritual aspects of death, such as preparing the body, weighing the heart, and guarding tombs. The way his names changed over time shows how flexible he was. The way Egyptians talked about Anubis changed over time, just like the way they buried their dead. One of the most interesting things to learn is how Anubis sees formal names compared to how he is described in personal prayers and texts. His names on big tombs stressed cosmic order and protection, but on smaller amulets and funerary papyri, he was often called upon in more personal ways. Families would write letters to Anubis asking him to stand by the dead person or protect the Ka, which is the person's spiritual essence. These simple requests show that regular Egyptians felt a personal connection to Anubis, even though he had high-ranking titles. People not only said his name in the halls of kings, but they also whispered it in the hopes of families who wanted to know that their loved ones would be safe in death. The significance of names in Egyptian culture elucidates the frequent inscription of Anubis's titles on his images. It would have been powerful to carve his jackal-headed form without words, but adding his name made it perfect. In temples and tombs, inscriptions that paired his picture with epithets made his presence even stronger. Writing was magical for the Egyptians because it made ideas real and permanent. By writing the name Inpu next to his figure, they made sure that Anubis's protective role was not only called upon, but also made real within the stone walls. This combination of text and image was a common way for Egyptians to express their religion, and Anubis's names were some of the most lasting in that tradition. We should also think about how names put Anubis in the larger family of gods. Even though myths were different, later traditions often said that he was the son of Nephthys and Osiris, or in other stories, of Nephthys and Set. His status as a progeny of these deities interconnected him with the cyclical themes of conflict and resurrection, inherent in Egyptian cosmology. In this way, his nickname, the Royal Child, may have meant more than just being born to gods. It may have also meant that he was the one who brought together different parts of the pantheon, He was a son of the gods and was involved in their great dramas, but his job as a funeral director kept him grounded in the real world. The changing nature of his parentage in myths suggests that what mattered most was not his bloodline, but his role. Egyptians were less interested in finding a single, clear story about Anubis, and more interested in figuring out what he meant to their religious lives. Greek and later Roman writers were fascinated by Anubis's unique shape and purpose. He was a natural counterpart to Hermes, their own messenger and guide of souls. This mixing created the god Hermanubis, who is a mix of both traditions. The name Hermanubis stood for the mixing of gods, as well as the mixing of languages and cultures that happened in the Mediterranean's cosmopolitan world. In this later version, Anubis still represented guidance and protection, showing that his essence stayed the same even when names changed and new layers were added. The fact that his identity stayed the same across languages shows how deeply his role touched on human fears about death and the afterlife. Anubis's names have changed over time, from Inpu in hieroglyphs to Anubis in Greek and Latin, from first of the Westerners to master of secrets. This is not just a history of language. It shows how Egyptians changed their ideas about the god over time. Each name tells a story about how people saw, believed, and changed. They show us how people who lived thousands of years ago dealt with the same questions we still ask today. What happens when we die? Who will help us get through it? What powers, whether we can see them or not, keep death from being the end? The Egyptians showed their faith in Anubis by giving him many names and believing that he would answer their questions and be there for them in the most uncertain times of their lives. How did Anubis's role change over time as Egyptian religion grew? And what does this tell us about how their beliefs changed? In the early days of the Egyptian state, Anubis was the most important god of funerary religion. Anubis was called the god of the dead during the early dynastic period and into the Old Kingdom, long before Osiris became the most powerful god of the underworld. His black jackal form was carved into tomb walls, and people prayed to him for protection and preservation. Back then, death was still a scary and unpredictable event for the Egyptians. Anubis's protection gave them the order and peace of mind they needed. The pyramids of the Old Kingdom, which were symbols of royal power and divine connection, were full of references to Anubis. This made sure that the pharaohs could safely enter the afterlife with the god's help. Anubis is the protector of kings in death in the pyramid texts, which are some of the oldest religious writings in the world. These texts, which were carved into the walls of burial chambers, say that he guided the soul, protected the body, and made sure that the dead pharaoh would rise again in the afterlife. He wasn't just here for the rituals, he was a big part of what it meant to be a king. People thought that the pharaoh was a god in life, so he needed a god to protect him in death. Anubis was the perfect choice for that. People thought of him not only as the god of embalming, but also as the one who stood at the door and watched over the most sacred change a king could go through. The importance of his role in these early texts shows how important he was to the religious ideas of the Old Kingdom. But as the years went by, the Egyptian pantheon changed. Osiris had become very important by the time of the Middle Kingdom. His myth of death and resurrection, in which his brother Set killed him and Isis brought him back to life, gave Egyptians a strong story about justice and renewal. Osiris became the lord of the underworld, the one who judged the dead and decided what would happen to them. This was a big change in the order of the gods, and it changed how people saw Anubis. Anubis was no longer the most powerful god of the dead. Instead, he became a servant, helping Osiris by overseeing embalming, guiding souls, and making sure that the judgment process was fair. This change shows us a very interesting example of how Egyptian gods were not fixed, but could change and take on new duties as myths changed. This change did not make Anubis less important. In fact, his job became more clear and focused. Osiris was the judge and ruler of the underworld, but Anubis was in charge of the more practical aspects of death, like preparing the body, guarding tombs, and weighing the heart. In many ways, he became the technician of the afterlife, the god who made sure everything was done right so that Osiris could make his decision. This split of duties is similar to how Egyptian society worked. Like priests, scribes, and craftsmen, who each had their own jobs to do to keep order, the gods also had their own jobs to do. The Egyptians believed that order and accuracy were important in life and death, and Anubis's careful attention to ritual and detail showed this. The Middle Kingdom also made Anubis known to more than just the kings. He was known to regular Egyptians as well. In the past, only pharaohs and other powerful people were thought to have access to the afterlife. By the Middle Kingdom, however, the idea of eternal life had become more common. This made the afterlife more accessible to everyone, so Anubis was called upon in the burials of both common people and royalty. The coffin texts, which came after the pyramid texts, show Anubis coming to help not only kings, but also regular people who wanted protection on their journey after death. His presence in these texts shows that he could serve people from all walks of life, which strengthens the idea that he was a god who cared for everyone, no matter what their status was. What stands out most about this time is how Anubis's images and roles became more consistent. People started to see pictures of him bending over a mummy on a funeral bier, with his jackal head protectively hovering over the body. This visual motif was used a lot in tomb art to show him actively embalming and preserving the body. The famous picture of Anubis fixing the wrappings of the dead or watching over the mummification table became a part of Egyptian culture during the Middle Kingdom. The rituals made the god's presence clear through these images, which made it no longer abstract. Anubis was not far away. He was right there, making sure that no mistakes would ruin the journey to eternity. Anubis still had a lot of symbolic power, even though he was now working for Osiris. He was still the one who weighed the heart of the dead person against the feather of Maat, the goddess of truth and order. This event was one of the most important parts of the whole journey through the afterlife. The heart, which was thought to hold a person's character and actions, had to be in balance with the feather. Ammit, the scary creature that was nearby, would eat the soul if it was full of bad things. If it was light, the dead could go on to the blessed fields of the afterlife. Anubis's job as the one who ran the scales showed how important he still was. Osiris may have made the decision, but Anubis made sure that the process itself was fair and true. Because he was fair, people trusted him. He didn't break the rules for kings or nobles. He treated everyone the same. This lack of bias may be why Anubis was still loved, even when Osiris became the main character. Egyptians thought of him as a god who didn't let politics or mythical drama get in the way of doing his job well. He was the careful protector who kept things in order when they were at their most fragile. Anubis's consistency was comforting to a society that cared a lot about balance and truth. He was a reminder that the need for protection in death would always be there, even if myths and hierarchies changed. The change in Anubis from the most powerful god of the dead to a protector and embalmer shows how Egyptian religion has changed over time. When new myths came out and became more popular, older gods changed instead of going away. Anubis's ability to change his role helped him survive for thousands of years in Egyptian history. Osiris was a symbol of the hope of coming back to life, while Anubis was a symbol of the certainty of protection. They worked together to make a partnership that dealt with the two biggest worries of the Egyptian people: their fear of death and their hope for eternal life. Anubis's constant presence was the base on which the promise of resurrection could stand in this partnership. We don't see Anubis getting worse over time, we see him getting better. Anubis was an important part of Egyptian religious life from the Old Kingdom, as god of the dead, to the Middle Kingdom, as master of embalming and guardian of judgment. He was able to serve generations of Egyptians because he could change. His black jackal form was a constant reminder that death could be faced with order and care. The story of how his role changed over time shows us that ancient religion was a living tradition that could grow and change, but it was always based on the need for comfort in the face of death. What did it mean for the Egyptians to let Anubis handle the embalming? To understand this, we need to go into the world of funerary rituals, where priests, tools, and chants work together to keep a body safe forever. The Egyptians did not see the body as just a shell. It was the Ka and Ba's anchor, and they needed a physical home to live on after death. Because of this, embalming was much more than just a practical thing to do. Anubis was in charge of the sacred performance, which was a ritual change. He watched over every cut, every bandage, and every application of oil. It was impossible to prepare the body properly without him, and without proper preparation, eternal life was impossible. The process of embalming itself took a long time and was very careful, sometimes taking up to 70 days. During this time, the body was carefully dried, treated, and wrapped to make sure it wouldn't rot. Both in ritual and in pictures, Anubis's part in this process was clear. People who worked for Anubis were often called servants of Anubis, and one of them would wear a mask with a jackal head to look like the god. This was not just a play. It was a real invitation for the god to come. To the mourners and family members who were watching the ceremony, it was Anubis himself who leaned over the coffin, touched the body, and whispered protection into the silence of the embalming tent. The line between human and divine became less clear, and the embalming became a partnership between people and their god. People thought that the embalming tent, which was called the Wabe, was a holy place. It was often put near the edge of the desert, close to the tombs but away from where people lived their lives. The rituals took place here in a serious way. Water from the Nile, the river that gave life to Egypt, was used to wash the body. They took out the internal organs except for the heart and put them in canopic jars. Each jar was protected by a different god. During the process, people prayed and sang hymns to Anubis, calling him Lord of the Sacred Land and Master of Secrets. These names made him seem like the one who knew the secrets of death and could make sure that no mistakes ruined the delicate process. The opening of the mouth ceremony, which took place near the end of the embalming process, was one of the most important parts of the ritual. This ritual symbolically brought back the deceased's senses, letting them eat, talk, and breathe again in the afterlife. Anubis was the most important part of this ceremony. He made sure that the body that had just been prepared was not only kept safe, but also brought back to life in a spiritual way. The ceremony showed that the Egyptians believed that death was not the end, but a change. Anubis gave the key to eternal life by showing people how to do the opening of the mouth. The ritual would not have been complete without him, and the dead person would not have been able to fully live in the world beyond. We see this holy role in many works of Egyptian art. One of the most lasting pictures is of Anubis bending over a mummy on a funeral bier. His jackal head looks down with calm authority, and his hands either hold the body steady or adjust the wrappings. This picture can be found in tomb paintings, papyrus scrolls, and statues. It supports the idea that Anubis was really there when the body was being embalmed. He wasn't far away, watching from the sky. He was directly involved in taking care of the dead. Seeing this picture made it clear that the dead person was not alone. They had a divine friend with them in their most vulnerable moment. The perfumes and oils used in embalming also had symbolic meaning, and Anubis's connection to them made his role even more important. These substances kept the body from decaying and also stood for purity and God's favor. People thought that the smoke from incense that curled through the embalming tent would clean the air and link the ritual to the gods. Each substance had a purpose: cedar oil for keeping things safe, myrrh for holiness, and natron for cleaning. Anubis's guidance made sure that nothing was missed in this mix of physical and spiritual elements. The Egyptians thought that even the smallest mistake could ruin the afterlife, so his title as Master of Secrets showed how much power he had over every detail. He was the keeper of knowledge, the one who knew the secret steps that people couldn't fully understand. We also learned that Anubis was linked to embalming in a way that kept bodies from being desecrated. The Egyptians were very aware of the danger that tomb robbers posed, and the chance that they might be forgotten. A disturbed body could destroy the soul's eternal home. People thought that Anubis, as a guardian, watched over tombs, and that his black form warned anyone who tried to get in. This protective quality was shown in funerary curses written on tomb walls that sometimes called on Anubis' anger against anyone who might disturb the resting place. It was not only wrong to disturb a grave, it was also wrong to do so against the god himself. The fear of his wrath made the burial even safer. Anubis's embalming role had another layer. He was fair. He didn't just work for kings and other important people. Anubis was also used in the burials of regular Egyptians, even though the grand rituals of royal embalming may have been more complex. People put amulets with his picture on them in their wrappings, wrote prayers to him on coffin lids, and buried small jackal figurines with common people. This made him one of the most popular gods in the pantheon. He was not distant or exclusive. He was a god who worked for everyone, making sure that everyone, no matter what their status, could find safety and protection in death. Anubis was very important in the process of embalming, which also changed how Egyptians thought about the relationship between gods and people. Many religions believe that gods are distant rulers who sit above the world and rule from afar. Anubis, on the other hand, was involved in the physical aspects of death. He wasn't just in charge, he was also a participant. This closeness put him in a special place in Egyptian spirituality, connecting the divine and the mortal. People knew that Anubis himself led the priests' hands when their bodies were ready. He was both transcendent and immanent, a god who lived in the heavens, but whose presence could be felt in the quiet sanctity of the embalming tent. So, for the Egyptians, embalming was more than just keeping flesh intact. It was about change, getting the body ready to be a strong enough vessel to hold the soul forever. This change was possible because Anubis had steady hands and hidden knowledge. He was the divine embalmer, the keeper of secrets, and the protector who made sure that no one was unprepared. The scary truth about death was less scary when he was there because he promised to take care of, be precise and guide. The rituals done in his name gave Egyptians the peace of mind that their loved ones would live on, not just in their memories, but as eternal beings ready to continue their journey in the next world. What happened to the soul after the body was ready and the burial was over? Embalming and protecting were just the start for the Egyptians. It wasn't easy to get to the afterlife. It was a journey that needed tests, trials, and most importantly, judgment. The weighing of the heart, one of the most famous scenes in Egyptian religion, was at the center of this belief. Anubis, the quiet and fair figure who made sure that every soul was measured fairly and accurately, was at the heart of this ritual. The Egyptians thought that the heart was more than just a body part. It was where memories, character, and moral worth were kept. The heart was everything to them, but the brain didn't mean much to them when it came to understanding human nature. It kept track of what someone did, what they wanted to do, and even what they were thinking but didn't say. When someone died, their soul went to the Hall of Two Truths. It was the heart that carried the weight of a lifetime. If it was full of bad things, the journey ended in destruction. The soul could go on to eternal life if it was light and pure. The weighing of the heart was the final judgment, and Anubis was the one who controlled the scales. Picture this scene as the Egyptians saw it. The dead person stands in front of a big balance, with Anubis leading the way. The heart is on one side, safe from the body. On the other side is Ma'at's feather. She is the goddess of truth, balance, and cosmic order. Ma'at stood for the idea that kept both the universe and society going, harmony that kept chaos at bay. Living against Ma'at meant making things messy, while living in accordance with her meant keeping the fabric of life itself intact. Anubis, calm and steady, puts the heart on the scale, adjusts the balance, and watches as the pans start to move. His black jackal face shows no bias or favoritism. The same thing happened to both kings and peasants. At this moment, every Egyptian was equal, judged not by their status, but by the truth. There were other divine figures next to the scales. The ibis-headed god of writing and wisdom, Thoth, wrote down the results very carefully. If the scales were even, the dead person was judged worthy and allowed into the afterlife. If not, the heart was thrown to Ammit, the scary eater who was part crocodile, part lion, and part hippopotamus. Being eaten by Ammit was the worst thing that could happen to you. It wasn't punishment in the sense of eternal torment, but complete erasure. The Egyptians were more afraid of this than any pain. It was losing who you are, your memories, and even your life. Anubis's job as the person who handled the scales was very important at this point. The process might be questioned if he weren't always there, but he made sure that things were fair. It's amazing how much faith the Egyptians had in Anubis as a fair judge. Anubis isn't like other gods whose stories are full of fights, arguments, or passions. He is almost always calm and dutiful. He can't be bought or scared into doing something. He doesn't make decisions. He measures things to make sure the process is honest. This lack of bias made Egyptians feel sure that their fate in the afterlife wasn't random. It depended on what they did, how well they followed Ma'at, and how accurate Anubis's scales were. In this way, he was the very definition of justice, not as a ruler like Osiris, but as the person who made sure that justice was done perfectly. This scene is often shown in the Book of the Dead, which is a collection of spells and pictures that were put in tombs. Scrolls show Anubis carefully moving the scales while the dead person waits nervously. He sometimes puts a hand on the scale to make sure it is accurate. The pictures show both the tension of the moment and the calm confidence of his role. Seeing this picture made you know that when your time came, Anubis would be there. Not to judge or forgive, but to give a fair judgment. His black figure next to the scales was meant to both reassure and warn. You didn't have to worry if you lived by Ma'at. The practice of weighing the heart also tells us a lot about Egyptian morals. Modern religions often talk about how God will reward or punish people, but the Egyptians put the blame on the person. The things you did in life decided how heavy your heart was. Did you tell a lie? Did you take something? Did you break the law or not take care of your family? All of these things were written down, not on paper, but in the heart itself. The well-known negative confession, which the dead person says in the afterlife, shows how important this is. The person says, "I have not killed, I have not stolen, I have not lied, I have not caused suffering." These words were not just statements. They were defenses meant to show that the heart would prove them true when weighed. Anubis's job made sure that these kinds of claims were checked against the truth. It is also important to understand that this moment was not only scary, it was also a good sign. Death was not the end for the Egyptians. It was a way to get to the next life. To pass the test of the scales meant to enter the fields of reeds, a blessed land where the dead could live in plenty, farm fertile fields, be with loved ones, and be at peace under the protection of the gods. So, Anubis was not only the god of judgment, but also the one who led people to paradise. He gave people the chance to live forever by helping their hearts find balance with Ma'at. In this way, his scales stood for both danger and opportunity. We can also see how Anubis's fairness went beyond myth and into real life. Egyptian law, government, and everyday life were all based on the idea of Ma'at. The idea of justice on earth was shaped by the idea of truth in the afterlife. It was the job of judges, officials, and rulers to uphold Ma'at, and the idea of balance was used in legal settings. Anubis's job in the divine court was similar to how Egyptians tried to make sense of their own world. His fairness was not only a religious ideal, but also a reflection of what people thought was right. In this way, the weighing of the heart linked cosmic and earthly justice, bringing together faith and action. Even when Greek and Roman ideas changed Egyptian religion in later times, the picture of Anubis at the scales stayed the same. In syncretic forms like Hermanubis, he still represented the guidance of souls and the promise of fair judgment. The continuity of this role across cultures indicates that the concept of an unbiased deity assessing the actions of the deceased had a significant impact beyond Egypt. It struck a universal chord, the human need to think that life has meaning, that what we do matters, and that death is not chaos but a reckoning that brings order. When we picture Anubis standing at the scales, black against the gold of papyrus, we see more than just a piece of art. This is the heart of what Egyptians believed about life, death, and justice. His calm presence and steady hand on the scale showed that everyone would be judged fairly. No matter how strong or weak, everyone's heart would be judged against the truth itself. At that moment, Anubis was there, neither harsh nor lenient, but exact, fair, and everlasting. The Egyptians found this both comforting and difficult. The scales would show your worth if you lived well. If you lived badly, Anubis's scales would show the truth. Either way, he was the god who made sure that the afterlife was not left to chance. When we think of the Egyptian gods, it's easy to picture them as separate beings, each with their own area of control. But the truth is that no god was alone. There were many family ties, rivalries, and overlapping roles between each god. Anubis was no different. He was often shown as a lone guardian. His origins and relationships within the divine family help us understand not only his role in Egyptian religion, but also how the myths about him changed over time. These changing connections show a lot about how flexible Egyptian beliefs were, and how gods could be reinterpreted to meet new religious needs. It is very interesting to think about who Anubis's parents were. It looks like he lived in Egypt's earliest days without a clear family tree. He was just the god of the dead, a separate being who stood on his own. But as myths changed and Osiris became the most powerful god in the underworld, storytellers started to include Anubis in this larger story. Some people thought that Anubis was the son of Osiris and Nephthys. In this version, Nephthys, who is Isis's sister, secretly gave birth to Anubis after sleeping with Osiris. Nephthys left the child to keep him safe, and Isis, who was kind and devoted to her children, took him in and raised him as her own. This story put Anubis in the middle of secrecy and care, which is very similar to the Osiris myth and explains why he is called the royal child. In a different story, Anubis is said to be the son of Set, the god of chaos, and Nephthys. This different lineage changes the dynamic a lot. He was Set's son, so he would be linked to the god, most known for chaos and violence. However, Anubis himself represented order and protection in the afterlife. Some scholars think that this paradox was meant to show how Egyptians often accepted contradictions in their religion. They made Anubis, his father, a god of chaos, to show how important he was as a stabilizing force in the face of destruction. His fairness and careful care for the dead would then be a direct counterbalance to Set's chaotic nature. Even though there are some differences, one thing that is always true is that Anubis was always a part of the big family drama between Osiris, Isis, Set, and Nephthys. This play was the most important part of Egyptian mythology, showing themes of death, resurrection, betrayal, and justice. Anubis's role in it made him even more important, even though the specifics of his parentage were not set in stone. Egyptians made sure that Anubis was always a part of the main story of life and death by connecting him to Osiris, either as his son or as his loyal helper. Instead, he became an important part of the divine system that explained how life and death work. Anubis was linked to his own divine friends in addition to his parents. Anput, his female counterpart, is sometimes called his consort. Her name was just the feminine form of his own, which showed how close they were. Like him, she was connected to funerary rituals and protecting the dead. Anput was never as well known as Anubis, but her presence shows that the Egyptians liked to make pairs of male and female gods to show balance and wholeness. Anubis and Anput made a divine household that was connected to funerary rites. This made the god's role more than just a solitary guardian. He was now part of a family structure. It was also said that Anubis had a daughter named Kebeshe. She was a goddess who was sometimes shown as a woman with a snake's head and sometimes as a snake. Her role was very important, but it was also very symbolic. She stood for the embalming fluid and the cleaning of the body. In funeral texts, she is said to refresh the dead, giving them cool water and cleanliness as they move on to the next life. This picture of refreshment in the middle of death shows how important balance was to the Egyptians. The Nile's fertility balanced out the desert's heat and dryness, and Kebeshe balanced out the harshness of death with the hope of renewal and comfort. By making her Anubis's daughter, The Egyptians made it clear that his realm was not just about serious protection, but also about care and kindness. These family ties also show that Egyptian mythology was not set in stone, but always changing. The Egyptians let different traditions live next to each other, unlike many later religions that carefully codified genealogies. In one temple, Anubis could be the son of Osiris. In another, he could be the son of Set. And in a third, he could be an independent god. This flexibility showed that the religious system put meaning and function ahead of strict consistency. It didn't matter who Anubis's father was. What mattered was what role he played in the lives of the Egyptians. He was always an embalmer, protector, and guide, even though the specifics of his family changed over time and in different places. It's also interesting to note how Anubis's relationships added to his titles and nicknames. His link to Osiris made him the first of the Westerners, which put him in direct contact with the land of the dead, which Osiris ruled. His connection to Nephthys and Isis as the master of secrets showed that he had access to secret knowledge and sacred rites. As Khebeshay's father, he was not only a protector, but also a source of comfort. As he got to know each person better, the meaning of his figure grew, making him more than just a god with one purpose. He was an important part of Egyptian cosmology, dealing with ideas like family, safety, secrecy, and renewal. Even when Egyptian religion mixed with Greek traditions during the Greco-Roman period, people still remembered Anubis's family ties. Writers from that time often talked about how he was Osiris's loyal son or helper, which showed how important he was to the great myth of resurrection. In this way, the stories about his parents and his divine friends kept making him who he was, making sure that he stayed a familiar and important part of Egyptian thought. So, when we think about Anubis's divine family, we're not just learning about myths. We are seeing how Egyptians used connections to put him in a bigger web of meaning. His mother, father, partner, and daughter all showed different sides of his personality, like being secretive, stable, protective, and refreshing. These ties made him seem more like a person and less like a god who was far away. They also helped worshippers see him as part of a family structure that was similar to their own lives. In a society where family ties were important to social identity, connecting Anubis to a divine family made him even more powerful. He wasn't just the jackal-headed guardian of tombs. He was a child, a friend, and a father. These roles made him very familiar to people, even though he worked in the mysteries of death. When we think of Anubis today, we usually think of how he looks. A black jackal head, tall ears, a sleek body that is often dressed like a man and standing up straight like a god. But why this shape, and why these colors and symbols? The symbols used for Anubis were not chosen at random. Each feature had a specific meaning that came from Egyptian culture, religion, and the world around them. And how Anubis's look came to stand for ideas of protection, death, and renewal. His head is the first and most obvious thing about him. The jackal was a creature that lived on the edges of life in Egypt. These animals roamed near cemeteries, especially in deserts where the dead were buried close to the surface. Families must have been scared when they saw or heard a jackal near a grave, but instead of seeing it as a threat, the Egyptians made it sacred. They made Anubis a guardian by giving him the head of a jackal, which is a scavenger. This change is a great example of how Egyptian religion worked. Instead of ignoring or destroying what was feared, they took it in and made it part of a system of meaning that gave it power and purpose. Because Anubis had a jackal head, it was both a warning and a promise. He was connected to death, but also to protecting the dead. The black color of Anubis's head and body is just as important. Anubis was always shown as black, even though natural jackals are sandy brown. In Egyptian symbolism, black was not the color of evil, but the color of fertility and new life. Every year, the Nile's floodwaters went down, leaving behind rich black silt that was good for the crops. This soil was the basis of Egypt's agricultural wealth, which is why black came to mean life and renewal. At the same time, bodies buried in the desert often turned darker as they dried, and embalmed bodies also turned darker. So, the black of Anubis's shape showed both sides, the color of death and preservation, and the color of new life and regeneration. Seeing him painted black made me remember that death is not the end, but a step in the cycle of rebirth. His role with the scales of judgment is another important symbol that is often associated with Anubis. The scales were one of his most important symbols because they were connected to the weighing of the heart, even though he didn't always hold them. The balance itself stood for Mahat's idea of truth, order, and harmony. Anubis was not only the protector of individual souls, but also the protector of the cosmic order when he stood next to it. His job made sure that justice was fair, that no one could cheat the system, and that the afterlife stayed in balance. So the scale was not only a tool, but also a holy symbol of fairness that was always connected to Anubis's calm and steady hand. Some pictures of Anubis show him holding a flail or a crook, which are things that are usually linked to kingship. These symbols linked him to authority, but Anubis's power was not about ruling the living like Osiris or Horus. It was about getting respect from the dead, not the living. The crook stood for guidance and the flail stood for discipline and control. Together, they made him look like the god who kept order in death by protecting tombs, keeping bodies safe, and leading souls to their judgment. Anubis's emblems were always about guardianship, ritual, and justice, unlike those of other gods, which were about war or creation. The way Anubis is shown in art also tells us a lot about what he means. He is often shown crouched like a jackal on top of a tomb, lying still and alert, as if he is guarding the body inside. This picture told families that their loved one was safe with him. In other pictures, he is standing next to a mummy, and either touching it gently or making a ritual gesture. This closeness in space shows that he is a caretaker rather than a distant ruler. Anubis didn't sit on a throne high above. He knelt next to the dead and took care of them. This iconography made him a god of presence and closeness, which reinforced the idea that he was really there when someone died or was buried. We also see Anubis in small statues and amulets. People often put these inside the wrappings of a mummy or carried them around as protection. The small jackal amulet was more than just a decoration. It was a way to carry the protection of the god with you. This picture of him being used every day shows how easy it was for regular Egyptians to get to Anubis. He wasn't just a god for big temples or royal ceremonies. People could also call on him in their own prayers. A small token of his image could always remind people of safety and order. The Egyptians also linked Anubis's image to the 9 bows, which was a name for Egypt's enemies, both human and spiritual. People thought of Anubis as a guardian who could deal with these threats and keep the dead safe from hostile forces. In this role, his symbols grew from protecting himself to protecting the whole universe. He was not only a protector of people, but also of Egypt itself, keeping both the living and the dead safe from chaos. His stance, color, and jackal shape all showed that he was alert and strong against anything that might upset the balance. It's amazing how consistent Anubis's images have been over the years. Anubis's form stayed very stable, even though many other gods changed their looks or merged with other gods. His jackal head, black body, and place next to the dead were just as well known in the New Kingdom as they were in the Old. This consistency shows how deeply his symbols connect with people. Egyptians from many different times and dynasties saw something important in his image that spoke directly to their fears and hopes about death. Anubis's domain was universal. Unlike gods who ruled over war, fertility, or the sun, everyone knew what his image meant because everyone, no matter who they were, had to face death. Even though Egyptian religion mixed with Greek and Roman traditions, Anubis's symbols stayed strong. When he became Hermanubis by merging with Hermes, he still had a jackal head, which showed that he was linked to the Egyptian idea of death. His symbols stayed true to their roots, even though they were changed to fit new cultures. No one ever confused the black jackal figure with anyone else, and this continuity made sure that Anubis's presence stayed even as Egypt changed. In the end, the images of Anubis were not just artistic choices, they were also theological statements. His jackal head reminded Egyptians of the line between life and death. His black color represented the strange mix of death and life. His scales and emblems stood for fair justice and protective power. Each symbol strengthened his role by bringing together fear, hope, and certainty. These pictures made Anubis more than just a god. He became the personification of what Egyptians needed most when they were about to die. A steady protector who promised order, fairness, and the chance to start over. The shrine found in the tomb of Tutankhamun is the best example of Anubis as the eternal guardian. When Howard Carter and his team opened the tomb of the boy king in 1922, they found a lot of things that amazed people today. One of the treasures was a statue of Anubis, carved to look like a reclining jackal, that was placed right at the entrance to the burial chamber. It was on top of a gilded shrine. This was more than just another burial item for archaeologists. It was a living example of how Anubis worked in the New Kingdom's beliefs, and how even a powerful pharaoh like Tutankhamun needed him. The shrine is very detailed and beautiful. The structure was built to be moved easily on a portable sled, which represented Anubis' ability to move around as a protector who could travel with the dead into the afterlife. The jackal statue on top was painted black, which is the color of the god, and it had eyes that were inlaid to make it look like it was watching over you. A ceremonial sash was draped over its back, which showed how important it was. The statue was facing west, toward the land of the dead, ready to protect the soul as it passed into eternity. The placement was on purpose. To get to Tutankhamun's burial chamber, you had to first pass under Anubis's watchful eye. The writing on the shrine supports its role as a protector even more. They call on Anubis as the lord of the sacred land, the god who watches over cemeteries and necropolises. Anyone who entered would be reminded by this name that they were entering a place where Anubis was in charge. The shrine at the entrance to the burial chamber was both a symbol and a part of the ritual. It was the line between the living and the dead. To cross it without respect was to risk angering the god himself. This was more than just decoration for the Egyptians. It was a way to protect the tomb and the king inside it from being disturbed. What makes this shrine so interesting is how it shows both the grandeur of royal burials and the deep fears that lay behind them. Tutankhamun was a king and a godlike figure, but he still needed Anubis to protect him. This fact shows a deep truth about Egyptian beliefs. Death made everyone equal. Pharaohs and regular people both had to deal with the same dangers in the afterlife and needed the same divine protection. The fact that Anubis was in Tutankhamun's tomb made people think that no one, no matter how powerful, could die alone. The god's watchful eyes were needed to make sure that people could safely get to the afterlife. The shrine's craftsmanship also shows how skilled and dedicated Egyptian craftsmen were. The jackal statue is well proportioned, with a sleek, muscular body and an alert rest position. The black paint has held up very well. After more than 3,000 years, the surface is still smooth. The gilded shrine below is covered in detailed inscriptions and designs that have been carefully placed to make it more holy. It wasn't just an artistic project to make such an object. It had religious meaning as well. The artisans who made it believed that every detail mattered, and that they were helping to keep the king safe for all time. They turned wood, gold, and pigment into a way for the divine to be present. The Anubis shrine also gives us some information about how Egyptians buried their dead. The fact that it was placed on a sled shows that it was meant to be part of the funeral procession. Processions were very important to the Egyptians. They carried or pulled statues, shrines, and ritual objects to the tomb. These processions were public shows of respect and devotion that made the burial seem even more holy. The Egyptians symbolically played the role of Anubis by including him in these processions. The shrine was not left behind. Instead, it was put permanently at the entrance to the tomb, making sure that the protection lasted forever. People who see the shrine today are often struck by how it looks. The statue still seems to watch with a piercing gaze in the quiet halls of the Egyptian Museum in Cairo, where it is now on display. It is still powerful, even though it is simpler than the more ornate golden objects in Tutankhamun's tomb. In fact, Its restraint makes it more powerful. Anubis doesn't impress people with his wealth or decorations. He impresses them with his watchfulness and confidence. This was exactly what the ancient Egyptians needed to feel safe. That even with all the treasures and grandeur of a royal burial, there was still a steady guardian making sure everything was in order and safe. The discovery of the shrine also helped shape how people think about Anubis today. Before Carter's dig, most of what people knew about Egyptian gods came from texts and temple reliefs. The shrine was a real, three-dimensional representation of Anubis's role. It was not just an object, it also showed how the Egyptians thought about death. When I saw the shrine in its original setting, facing west and protecting the king's chamber, I realized that Anubis was not a distant myth, but a constant presence that was part of every step of the burial. Archaeologists and historians could use the shrine as proof of how important he was to Egyptian religion, adding physical proof to what they had written about him. The shrine has a symbolic meaning that still resonates, in addition to its historical importance. It reminds us that even though we are afraid of death or don't know what will happen, we should be ready for it. The Egyptians didn't leave the trip up to chance. They put a guardian at the entrance to the tomb to show that the dead would not be left alone. Anubis stood still and watched, promising that the soul would be safe as it crossed into the unknown. This message is still powerful for people today because it speaks to a universal need for comfort in the face of death. So, the Anubis Shrine of Tutankhamun is more than just an object. It gives us a glimpse into the beliefs of a culture that put a lot of meaning into the journey of death. It shows us that Anubis's presence was not just a concept. It was real, carved and painted into shape, and put in the right place. We can see the essence of his role in this one object. He is a guardian, protector, and eternal watcher. The Egyptians believed that having Anubis at the door of the tomb would keep things in order, even after death, and make sure that the soul was never alone. To comprehend the rationale behind this amalgamation, it is essential to examine the common attributes of both deities. In Greek mythology, Hermes was the Psychop, which means he led the souls of the dead to the underworld. He was fast, smart, and able to move freely between the worlds of gods, people, and the afterlife. Anubis, from a very different tradition, did a similar job. He led souls, oversaw the weighing of the heart, and made sure that the transition to the afterlife went smoothly. The Greeks saw these similarities when they came across Egyptian religion after Alexander the Great took over. They thought it made sense to put the two people together. Hermanubis was born this way. He was a god with the black jackal head of Anubis. Temples in Egypt that were dedicated to Anubis still worked, but now they were also home to new cult practices that were more in line with Greco-Roman ideas. People in the Roman Empire and other places outside of Egypt began to worship Hermanubis. People have found amulets and small statues with his picture on them in places as far away as Italy, which shows how popular he was in the Mediterranean area as a whole. Romans already believed in a complicated and layered afterlife, and Hermanubis promised to help them through death. He was familiar enough to fit into their religious beliefs, but he was also exotic enough to have the mystique of Egyptian wisdom. People who were interested in the mix of Greek, Roman, and Egyptian religious traditions liked him because he had two identities. The use of masks was one of the most interesting things about Hermanubis' role in this later period. Priests who performed funerary rituals sometimes wore masks that looked like Anubis. This was a very old Egyptian custom. This practice became more important in the Greco-Roman world. The priest in the mask was Hermanubis, and he was the direct link between the gods and the people who were grieving. Inscriptions and funerary art from this time show that people thought of Hermanubis as both a guide for the dead and a god of ritual performance, whose presence could be felt through human intermediaries. Even with these changes, Anubis's core remained the same. He was always the god of change, the one who led souls from one state of being to another, whether he was called Anubis, Inpu, or Hermanubis. The cultural lens through which he was seen changed. He was the protector of mummies and tombs for the Egyptians. Greeks thought of him as the Greek god Hermes, who was the quick guide of souls. He was a figure of strange wisdom to the Romans, representing the mystery and power of Egyptian religion. Every culture added something new, but none took away the core. When we look at other Egyptian gods, it's amazing how long Anubis has lasted in these later traditions. Some gods, like Ra or Horus, were harder to fit into Greco-Roman religion because their roles were so closely tied to Egyptian cosmology. Anubis, on the other hand, talked about a universal concern: what happens to the dead? Each culture grappled with the inquiry regarding post-mortem existence, to which Anubis offered a comforting response. There exists a guide, unbiased and steadfast, who will facilitate your passage. This universality made him very flexible and helped him stay alive long after pharaonic Egypt fell apart. Even though Christianity spread throughout the Roman Empire and eventually replaced traditional pagan worship, Anubis's name lived on. The idea of a psychopomp, a being who guides the soul after death, had an impact on later religious traditions. In the story of Hermanubis, we see how a god can go beyond his original context and become one with others while still being himself. Anubis's black jackal head was still his trademark, but it was now paired with Hermes' symbols, taken to new places and accepted by new people. He was able to change with the times, so he didn't fade away with the old kingdoms. Instead, he lived on in the minds of people in the Mediterranean. The Egyptians made a guardian of the dead, but the Greeks and Romans saw him as something more universal, a figure who could guide, protect, and help people move on. Why does Anubis still fascinate us today, thousands of years after the last Egyptian temple closed? His image has lasted longer than most other gods' images. Part of why he has lasted so long is because his shape is so simple, a black jackal-headed god who watches over the dead. But more importantly, it's because the questions Anubis stands for are still with us. What happens when we die? Who will help us through it? Is there justice after death, or is it just quiet? These questions have been asked in many cultures and over many years. Anubis is still a symbol of the hope that death is not chaos, but a journey that can be made with help and care. Anubis's legacy was already a big part of funerals in ancient Egypt, where they lasted for more than 3,000 years. He was always with the dead because he was in tombs, on papyrus, and in prayers. Even though Osiris was the ruler of the underworld, Anubis stayed the guardian, embalmer, and psychopomp. This ability to change meant that people never really stopped worshipping him, even when dynasties came and went. When Greeks and Romans met him, they called him Hermanubis instead, showing that his role could go beyond cultural boundaries. In this way, he spread beyond Egypt and his symbols spread to the rest of the Mediterranean world. But Anubis's story didn't stop in the past. In recent years, he has come back in books, movies, art, and pop culture, where he is often one of the most well-known Egyptian gods. The black, smooth jackal head on his body has come to mean mystery, death, and ancient power. He plays the role of a tomb protector or a supernatural authority figure in movies like The Mummy and Gods of Egypt. Comics and video games have used his image to show either dark strength or fair justice. Even though these pictures often make his role seem simpler or bigger than it really was, they still show what he stood for: the god who watched over the passage between life and death. Scholars and archaeologists are still very interested in Anubis. The Anubis Shrine from Tutankhamun's tomb is still one of the most photographed and studied objects in modern museums. Exhibitions featuring Anubis draw large crowds, and even people who don't know much about Egyptian religion can recognize his image right away. Many people feel strange when they stand in front of a statue of Anubis, as if they are being watched by something that goes beyond time. This is exactly what the Egyptians wanted to happen. The image of Anubis was never meant to be passive. It was meant to guard, protect, and keep intruders away. He still seems to do that job even now, thousands of years later, in glass cases. There are also less obvious ways that Anubis's legacy lives on. The idea of a psychopomp, a person who helps souls after they die, lived on in later religions. Angels often play this role in Christianity, taking the dead to heaven. In Greco-Roman religion, Hermes or Charon did this. In many cultures today, stories still talk about guides or guardians who help the soul move on after death. These figures look and believe different things, but the main idea is the same as Anubis's ancient role. People may not say his name anymore, but the role he played has become universal. Anubis has also become popular again because of modern spirituality and occult traditions. In some esoteric traditions, he is seen as a master of secrets, in the truest sense, someone who knows things that others don't. Writers and artists use his symbols to talk about death, change, and justice. People don't fear his black form. Instead, they welcome it as a reminder that death is part of the cycle of renewal. In this way, Anubis has changed again. He is now not only a god of the ancient dead, but also a figure for modern seekers who are trying to figure out what life means and how to deal with death. Anubis is more enduring than other Egyptian gods because he is universal. Ra, Horus, and Osiris are important gods, but their roles are based on Egyptian cosmology, like the sun's cycle, the pharaoh's kingship, and the Osiris myth. But Anubis represents something that every culture has to deal with: the unknown of death and the hope of help. Because he was fair, protected, and a symbol of renewal, he was someone who could go beyond Egypt's borders and time itself. He wasn't tied to just one myth or king. He was part of every soul that went to the afterlife. When we see Anubis today, whether it's in a museum, a movie, or even a comic book, we're not just seeing a picture from the past. We're also being reminded of questions that still bother us. His presence makes us think about what comes next, about what happens to justice after death, and about how we hope we won't have to go through the journey alone. Anubis was the Egyptians' promise that no soul would be left behind. He still represents for us that death doesn't have to be chaotic, even though it is. It can be a passage, one that a steady, watchful guardian who has walked with people for thousands of years leads. So, Anubis's legacy isn't just in history or myth, it's a human thing. He stands for our need for safety, justice, and comfort when we are on the edge of the unknown. That's why his picture lasts. That is why we can still recognize him right away, even though it was thousands of years ago that he was first shown on a tomb wall. That is why Anubis, the jackal-headed guardian, will always be there for us and haunt us as long as we try to find meaning in death.